All right, so thanks again, everyone, for spending your lunch with us today. It's my pleasure to introduce Keith Pelletier. He's a PhD student over in the Department of Forest Resources, and today Keith's going to talk about object-based image analysis. So, all right, Keith.
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you, everyone, for coming out this afternoon. What I'm going to do today is talk to you. I'm going to give you a broad overview of object-based image analysis. I'll talk about some of the concepts behind an object-based approach. And then I've pulled some examples from projects I've worked on in the past and a project that I'm working on as part of my research here at the university to illustrate how we implement an object-based approach. What I'd like to start with are a handful of pixels. Actually, some of them are a little hard to see, but when you look at these pixels or picture elements, that basic, the smallest unit of a digital image, what do you see? Colors?
Squares and colors.
Squares and colors. Great. If we zoom out, those pixels are associated with that tree right there. Now that you've got a lot more pixels and a lot more information, looking at this image, this is an area near Richfield, just south of here, you can start to pick out individual features. And it's those visual cues, whether it's the shape of a feature or the color or the context in which that feature appears, that you then can make sort of qualitative judgments about this. You know, what am I seeing? I'm seeing a house, a lake, a building. But ultimately, what we want to do with things like satellite imagery is generate meaningful information. And that's what I really want to emphasize today, is how we can take all of these different geospatial data resources and create meaningful information or maps and quantify what we see in those images. And oftentimes, the reason we need this meaningful information is that we need to make decisions. We might want to decide where to plant a tree. And in planting trees, we're increasing the amount of green space in a community and addressing longer-term concerns with air and water quality. It might also be related to shorter-term concerns, like flooding or large precipitation events. Some of you might be familiar with the flooding that happened in Duluth in June 2012. A lot of communities were flooded in that area. It impacted the human environment, and it also impacted the natural environment. And the ability to map those features is really important for making decisions about how to address flooding concerns or water quality concerns. You can see quite a bit of sediment in this stream. To do this, we want to take advantage of the imagery and other data sources we have available to us. I've already talked about imagery and given you an example. We also have very detailed surface information about vegetation and buildings. We've got surface information about topography, again, very detailed. We also have vector layers. So we've got polygons that represent buildings, polygons representing surface waters, vegetation, transportation infrastructure. And we also have geographies. So we can summarize this information, these maps, by different geographies, whether it's land use, property parcels, watersheds, or communities. Traditionally, we've mapped features or created classifications by using photo interpretation, where a human will go in, they'll digitize the boundary of a feature and label it. And what you're seeing here in orange, you've got roads. In yellow, you've got parking lots and driveways. And then in red, you've got buildings. Very detailed, but also very labor intensive. So we've also looked at ways of doing semi-automated approaches to mapping things, and oftentimes this relies on moderate resolution imagery like Landsat. And we can come up with similar things. So I showed you buildings and parking lots and roads, impervious surfaces, those sealed surfaces. This is a map of imperviousness based on Landsat. The darker the red, the more imperviousness. But when we look underneath those individual pixels that were defined based on color, we can see a lot more detail in the high resolution imagery. And then when we try to summarize that and look at things like patterns of property ownership, here I've put a parcel layer over that impervious layer, you can see that there's not a whole lot of detail at the parcel level. That's where we need an approach, an object-based approach, that takes advantage of what the human sees and interprets, and the semi-automated approaches that use things like color, but also other things that I'll talk about. So what is an object-based system? I've talked about the data that's available. Oftentimes it's freely available, but someone's paid for that. We've invested a lot of money in that data. We want to take advantage of that data. And then we want to replicate the human. So we want that level of detail that humans get, but we don't want to have to spend the time mapping features when we have concerns like flooding or other short-term events that we need data in a very rapid form. Now the components of an object-based system: raster, vector, and point cloud or LiDAR data. So we want to take advantage of all of those data sources, not just the imagery, and we want to integrate them. We want to use an expert system or a knowledge-based system. So we want to use that human knowledge, what you see in that image, and incorporate that into creating these maps. And we want to be able to do this over very large areas. So we want to think about things like enterprise processing. I won't talk a whole lot about that, but I'm happy to answer questions about the enterprise processing or batch processing at the end. So how does an object-based workflow actually work? The initial step is segmentation. So segmentation is this process where we create these homogeneous groups of pixels based on size, shape, and area. And those are called image objects. Once we have those image objects, we've got information from integrating data. So we can create the objects and then pull in information from the surface models or the vector data. We can use those spectral properties. We could use the color to assign them to a class. And then we can do some other functions. We can manipulate those objects so that they better reflect those real-world features. And an important aspect of this is that it's iterative. So we're building up information as we classify features. So we might start out by identifying trees and then move on to other features. And then by identifying those features, we can then build in context. So what does this look like? Let's return to this scene. So I suggested early on that when you look at this, you can see some trees, you can see some buildings and roads. So when we run segmentation on it, we end up with something like this. So those blue outlines are representing the features at different scales within this image. So now that tree that I pointed out initially, you can see the boundary around that tree. You can see the boundaries of the roads. So now we've got those objects. Now we need to create a map. So we have all this information within those objects that we then use to label them. And we end up with this map or some meaningful information. So now we could look at this from the perspective of how many buildings are in this area, how large are the lakes, etc. Now to do this, to use the information that humans use, oftentimes we have to kind of trick the computer into seeing things the way we see things. And one thing that we often use as humans are shadows. So you see the shadow next to the tree or the building, and you know that that's a tall feature. I've added a shadow to this. You know, height and depth, those are a couple of those cues you'll use, and that helps you see those words. But when we're trying to use this in an object-based system, height and depth, it's rather complicated to use just the shadow. So we need detailed information about the vertical structure of features. Some of you are probably very familiar with light detection and ranging data, or LiDAR. LiDAR is an active sensor, so as that sensor passes over the Earth, it's sending out thousands of laser pulses per second, and those pulses return, and we get information about the ground from those pulses, but also individual trees and buildings, and it's very, very detailed. And that gives us depth or height to use in a classification. This is the St. Paul campus. Some of you may recognize this. This is looking from above. So this is an aerial image for the same area. You can see that we've got those shadows for the depth information, but if we're really trying to delineate features that are tall, we're going to need the LiDAR information. So we can take that point cloud and turn it into a layer that gives us information about the height of features. So the bright features, or the white features, are the tall features. You can see you've got some tree canopy here, the buildings. That circle at the top is the water tower with the M on it that you see on the St. Paul campus. So that's one way that we can incorporate height and depth, one of those visual cues that we as humans use to interpret imagery. Another way is by using context. And this is one of the big limitations of those pixel-based approaches that I talked about, where they were just using color. With context, we're talking about spatial relationships. And the way that we use context in an object-based approach is actually very, very much related to the first law of geography. So we think about everything is related, but when we're looking at things in relation to each other, the closer they are, it's likely they're more related. The further they get apart, the less likely they are related. What does this mean in an object-based approach? We might look at topological relationships, or the shared boundary between features. And if we're looking at objects and they've got a shared boundary, sometimes that boundary tells us that they're different. Sometimes that boundary tells us that they're similar and we want to merge those. We can also use patterns on the landscape. So I showed you some maps of buildings. So if we see an area that has very few buildings, very few roads, these large vegetated areas, that's a cue that it's agricultural. And oftentimes with agricultural fields, when we see a recently plowed or a harvested field, it's very bright. It looks like a parking lot. To tell the computer that just because it's bright and big and square that it's an ag field isn't enough information, but we can build in that idea that there's very few buildings and very few roads, and compare those areas to other areas that have a lot of buildings, a lot of roads, and even though you've got these bright, square, rectangular features, we can train the computer to say, okay, this is urban. There's a lot of buildings, a lot of roads. Classify that as a parking lot, different from that recently plowed or harvested agricultural field. So let's return to looking at objects and how we classify them, and this notion of depth and context. This is also near Richfield. And what I want to point out are these shadows and this building leaning a little bit in this image, and the shadow over there. When we include the LiDAR data, we can now see this building was leaning over here, this dark shadow was here. We can actually see what's in these locations that are, spectrally, we don't have any information. Do some segmentation, create those objects. This segmentation was based on the LiDAR, not the optical data, but you can see under the optical data that we've got some features there. And then we can classify them and split that LiDAR surface model into buildings and then trees. And what you'll notice there in those circles is that we couldn't see those trees in the imagery, but in the LiDAR, we're able to see them. And the other piece of this is that LiDAR, just because something's tall, doesn't mean that we know whether or not it's a building or a tree, but I've got that optical data in there, and I can use the spectral values to split it out into trees and buildings. So the next example I want to show you, this is from, I pulled this from a larger land cover mapping project I worked on several years ago. It's for Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania. For those of you that have maybe watched The Office, Scranton is in Lackawanna County. And what I wanted to illustrate for this group in particular is that oftentimes when we're using an object-based approach, it's not just about creating a land cover classification. We often do other functions. So for this project, we were doing land cover, but they were also interested in having their roads mapped. So they had polyline data. And the polylines were for the edge of the road. And when we looked at this, we thought, oh, this is a really simple problem. All we have to do is close those polylines, and we'll have polygons, and we've got our roads layer. Well, what was happening is we were getting these areas closed that are obviously not roads. So we wanted to automate that process so that we could have fewer people working on editing this vector data and getting closer to that final map. So we looked around. They also had center lines. So in an object-based approach, we were able to pull in the center lines and the edges of the roads. And based on where there was a center line and an edge of road, so context, we were able to actually fill in where the roads actually are and avoid filling these areas or creating polygons for these areas where there aren't roads. But also, if we just use the center line alone, we've got this center line that's not enclosed by the boundary of the road. So that would just create a road where there isn't a road. And also, in looking at the spectral properties, notice that parking lot up there has very similar spectral properties as the roads. So by growing out that center line until it met the boundary for a road, we were able to produce this layer. So there's fully automated. There's no technicians going in and editing these polygons that aren't roads. We're not relying on the spectral properties and getting confusion with things like that parking lot, and we've now got a road layer that we can use as part of our analysis and that county can use for other analyses. So far, I've shown you examples of a single snapshot in time. And oftentimes, that's what a land cover layer is. And what we can actually also do with an object-based approach is look at things like changes over time. So the flooding example that I mentioned in Duluth, they've got 2 dates of LiDAR data. They've got a lot of really wonderful imagery. And that flooding, as I hinted at early in this presentation, had an impact on not only the human environment, but the natural environment. And when we look at images, so this is a WorldView 2 image that was acquired 6 days after that storm in Duluth. It's actually part of that archive that Len mentioned earlier. What you can see is we've got some landslides here, we've got some debris flows, and we've got some flooding. Minnesota also acquired LiDAR in 2011, so before the flood, and then 2012 after the flood. So we can take that data and bring it into an object-based system and begin to map some of these features. So here's the digital elevation model from 2011. Again, pay attention to this area up here. So this is before the flood. When we look at that same digital elevation model, we see after the flood, highlighting that debris flow there. That's something you could see pretty quickly in that image. So what we can do is we can bring in those digital elevation models and that optical data, create objects, and then classify features. And when we create these classifications, we can then start to look at changes on the landscape. So here, you could see that erosion, that landslide. You can also see the deposit, and it's a little washed out. I apologize for that, but you see that large green area there. and then this large red area. So we've got erosion in red and then deposition in green. And a lot of other things happening on the landscape that we may not have picked up on just by looking at the satellite image. They may not have been readily apparent. And we could see them in the LiDAR, but how do we map them? And this is where an object-based approach allows us to map them and calculate things like the change in volume of sediment on the landscape. We can also look at the surface information. So we could look at the impact on the vegetation and how the forest changed in this area. So here we are, 2011. This is the forest. Those are the trees in 2011. We look in 2012, and we can see that there's some new openings in the canopy that weren't there in 2011. And then, by using an object-based approach and combining the data, incorporating some of those cues, we can start to map this landscape and map the impact that this flooding had on the landscape. So what you're seeing here is, here's where the forest is remaining in 2012, but here's where we've lost the forest, so that the canopy's been opened up from that landslide. So now we're getting the vertical structure above the landscape. We've already mapped the landscape, but we're also able to map the flooding, where the extent of that water following that storm. And it's not just the impact of that flooding on the natural landscape. We can also look at buildings and other urban features that have been flooded. So you can see there's this residential area here that's still flooded 6 days later. You see the buildings there, and it's also impacting the forest. And the dark blue is where the water is normally located. This is the St. Louis River, and then the light blue is where the flooding's occurring. We can also apply this approach to looking at how stream channels change. This is the same area. So this is Mission Creek. It's a tributary to the St. Louis. And what you're seeing here is that same, 6 days after the flood. You can see the impact. Here's a road right here. You can see that the channel extends into the road. When we look at this in 2011, and I'm really sorry, you can't see the stream channel. So the stream channel is following a relatively straight course down the middle of the screen. When we look at it in 2012, so if I back up to that image, it's no longer following that straight course. It started to meander much more. It's impacting the vegetation here and the road there. When we look at this, by combining those LiDAR layers and segmenting and creating objects, we can now see how that landscape has changed. So this dark blue is the former channel right here. The new channel, this green color, that's where that channel's moved and eroded. So it's really altered that landscape in this area. And we can now take this information and come up with volume measurements, like I showed before with the landslides. We can also map that stream and look at the horizontal changes in it and create maps. And ultimately, from these maps, that's where we get that meaningful information. But this meaningful information, the maps, an additional aspect of having meaningful information, and I had kind of hinted at this with the geographies, is the ability to summarize that information at varying scales. I'm going to focus on the very fine scale, because that's where oftentimes we're making decisions. And I'll return to this example that I started with. So what we're seeing in this area are relatively small parcels. And if we're looking at ownership patterns and we want to summarize the land cover, at this level, if we're using something that's coarse, we're not going to get the level of detail we need. So if we use that land cover that I showed you before, we can come up with summaries like this. And we can look at per parcel imperviousness, where the red or orange parcels, there's a lot of pavement there. We might want to target those for concerns about surface runoff and water quality. And then we've got the green parcels where we've got less impervious surfaces. And what that is a summary of those objects, those features that are mapped within each parcel. We can also look at other things. So we've got that land cover, but we can just pull out the tree canopy. We've mapped the trees, and we can start to look at where the trees are in this community. You know, what parcels have a lot of trees, what parcels don't have a lot of trees. And when we're looking at what parcels don't really have a lot of trees, we can start looking at ways to increase the amount of trees there, and taking that meaningful information and making decisions and using that information to make better decisions and address those concerns, whether it's air and water quality concerns or the shorter term flooding or erosion concerns. And with that, I think we've got time. Happy to take any questions.